Welcome, everybody. My name is Kevin Hayes, and I'll be moderating tonight's presentation. Very happy that you're with us. As I said just a few minutes ago, we have about 315 people registered. We're hoping that we get over 200 tonight. Just very excited that you're all interested in the topic that we have on hand. I would like to introduce the co-sponsors, and their names are going to come up on the screen. As I do that, we've got the Catholics for Change in Our Church as one group, Pittsburgh-based group. We also have Catholics Vote Common Good. We also have the Franciscan Action Network, also the Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice. Both Franciscan Action Network and Network are located in DC. And also Vote Common Good is a co-sponsor. So we want to thank all of them. They're up on your screen. If you're interested in any of them, their websites are shown. You can also Google any one of them and get their website that way. The topic, just in case you're tuned into the wrong event, the topic tonight is Salt, Light, and Leaven, Living Our Faith in a Democracy. Our presenter tonight is John Carr. John is the founder and past director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought in Public Life at Georgetown University.
Hi there. Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Barbara. And thanks to all the people who have made this possible. I think it's only 50-50 if I get through this with sharing my screen and muting and unmuting myself. So patience will be an issue here. Let me see if we can make that happen. This is the title, Salt, Light, and Leaven, Living Our Faith in a Democracy. When we agreed on this about 6 months ago, it seemed like a nice, quiet conversation. Who knew what the context would be? Our calling to live our faith in this election year is more challenging, more complicated than it's ever been. Sister Barbara talked about my work at the intersection of faith and politics. When I was growing up, I wanted to be a priest or a senator. I actually went to the seminary and I fell in love with my wife, Linda, and that took care of the priest part. And then I lost my first election, and that took care of the senator part. But I was blessed to find a way to combine my commitment to faith and my interest in politics and service in our church and in other ways. I've been a long-time admirer of this association and many of the co-sponsors, the Franciscan Action Network, great voices here in Washington. And I'm learning more about Catholics for Change in the Church, Catholics, both the Common Good and Vote Common Good. I have to admit I'm a little anxious and a little discouraged, frankly. There's so much good in my life, but the things I care the most about, in some ways, the church, our church, and our political life are not where they should be. And when you put those two things together, they can explode on us. And then when the Catholic Church talks about democracy, we ought to acknowledge that we're a little bit new to the conversation. One of the great achievements, I think, of the Synod is for the first time in 2,000 years, lay women, religious women, clergy, and laymen are at the table discussing and voting on a path forward to the church. So it's taken us a while to take seriously some of the opportunities of democracy. I also admit I'm an outsider. Pennsylvania is one of the places where this coming election will be decided. And I don't know anything about Pennsylvania, except that I'm not a big fan of the Phillies. I assume this is a Pittsburgh crowd, so we have that in common. The I often tell the story. I feel a little bit like a guest preacher. I'm sort of an outsider. Yeah, I often tell the story of a guest preacher at an important parish event. He prepared well. He thought he had delivered the message well. And when Mass was over, he stood in the back of the church when as people were leaving. And most folks were very kind, very complimentary. But at the very end of the line, a guy came out and he reached out his hand and he said, you talk too fast. You really didn't have much to say. And it wasn't very helpful. Well, obviously, this bothered the preacher. He turned to the pastor and he said, who is this guy? And what is his problem? And the pastor said, oh, don't worry about him. He just goes around repeating what everybody else is saying. So I know I'm going to talk fast. I'm going to try and get a lot in 40 minutes. I hope it might be helpful, but I'm not hanging around for the reviews after church. Here is the perspective. When I first got to know the association was when I worked at the
Fixes itself for a little while.
for a long time. And it was one of the places where lay people and priests worked together to advance the vision of the Second Vatican Council. You did synodality before synodality was cool. And frankly, before it had a fancy name. I now work at Georgetown. We have this little initiative. And I would like to suggest that our work is a sign of hope in tough times. We're 10 years old. We've done 160 dialogues, many with just young people and young Latinos. We've drawn 300,000 people to those discussions. And we have found there is a hunger for the moral vocabulary of Catholic social teaching and a thirst for the kind of dialogue that this group represents. Like many of you, the experience I bring, which cuts the deepest, is as a parent and now a grandparent. We have 2 new babies in the last 6 months. It's great fun. The best part is we get to see them and then they go home. And our family is terrific, but we just had a terrible experience where my daughter-in-law went in for a routine procedure that went horribly, horribly wrong. It was supposed to have been in and out, a robotic procedure. They ended up cutting blood vessels, enormous, massive bleeding. Without going into it all, she went into a coma. They came to my son and said they were going to have to amputate her left leg and knee or she would die that evening. She is coming out of it. She's on the mend, the rehabilitation. But I'm dealing with, from a distance, 2 of the systems in our society, healthcare and the law. And I can only imagine what people who don't have our resources, don't have our insurance, don't have all the friends who have rallied to us. So what kind of world are we leaving to our kids and our grandparents? How do we pass on the faith to them when they have so many questions about it? Because part of this tonight is about politics, I should tell you, I'm a product of a mixed marriage. Both my parents are Minnesota Catholics. My mother is from St. Paul, my dad from Minneapolis. That's a bigger deal than you know. But of more relevance, my mother's family are absolutely committed Republicans. My uncle was a Republican leader of the Minnesota Senate. And my dad's family, diehard Democrats. My grandfather was Hubert Humphrey's finance chairman when he ran for mayor. And there are a few people on this call who still remember Hubert Humphrey. So I believe that we can act on our faith in different parties and in different ways. What I would like to do tonight, and let's see if I can make this work, is do 5 things. want to begin with 5 images. Then I want to talk a little bit about the mission and message of being salt, light, and leaven. And then I want to talk about the context and some of the assets we have as disciples of Jesus and members of the church. A few minutes on directions and dangers, but frankly, let's leave a lot of that for the questions and discussion. And if time permits, a few examples and maybe a concluding story. Here are the images that I want us to think about. Many probably remember this image. This is John Kennedy in 1960 before the Houston Ministers Association. It's important to remember that people thought John Kennedy should not be elected president because he would take advice to the Pope, that his religion, our religion, was a disqualifying factor. This was not a marginal thing. This was Billy Graham. This was Dr. Martin Luther King Sr. This was Norman Vincent Peale, President Trump's pastor. We've come a long way. 8 years ago, Pope Francis stood at the well of the house. I had the honor of being in that room. I couldn't imagine that. And I was watching the Holy Father, excuse me, I have a cold, but I was drawn to the 2 men behind him. Joe Biden, a Catholic kid from Pennsylvania, and John Boehner, a Catholic kid from Ohio. They were old enough to remember that John Kennedy shouldn't be president, according to some, because he would take advice from the Pope. And the only 2 things they agreed on was that this Congress needed advice from this Pope. So we have come a long way. The other thing I remember about that day is immediately after the speech, the Holy Father went out and waved to the crowd. And then it's the tradition when big shots, heads of states, come to the Capitol, they have a big luncheon with all the powerful people. And the Pope said no. And he had lunch with the hungry and homeless of Washington, giving us an example that our leaders should follow and we should follow. Another image, not that long ago, 3 years ago, is of the insurrection, the violent attack on our Capitol, the refusal to accept the results of the election, encouraged by the President of the United States, Donald Trump. And many of the people in that crowd, including this gentleman apparently, thought they were doing God's work, that this is what Jesus called them to do. The next image is of the Acropolis. And this is more a warning from Pope Francis. When he was in Athens, the birthplace of democracy, try a cough drop. He said, "We are witnessing a retreat from democracy. Democracy requires participation and involvement on the part of all. Consequently, it demands," I can't read it because there's something in the way here. "It is complex, whereas authoritarianism is peremptory, and populism's easy answers appear attractive." So he warned us that democracy was at risk in Europe, but in our own country as well. The part I couldn't read, democracy requires hard work and patience. And then just 2 weeks ago, this is what Donald Trump said when he accepted the endorsement of a group called Catholic Vote. It's a partisan Catholic group. He said he was happy to have the support of Catholics. He had said in the past he didn't understand why he didn't get more Catholic support. But he said, "I don't know what's going on with Catholics because the FBI is going after Catholics. Why would any Catholic vote for a Democrat?" What are they doing? I hear stories that are just horrible. Why would a Catholic be voting for Biden or a Democrat? It doesn't make sense. It's horrible. This is a reference to Rogue, an awful memo that was done in Richmond, raising questions whether traditional Catholics were somehow a danger to the country. It was repudiated by the FBI, but it's the way that Trump wants to appeal to Catholics because he thinks the administration is a threat to us and our faith. I want to stop sharing for. So our participation in this democracy has always been complicated. We were outsiders. We were a minority. We have become very active. We are key factors in this election and every election. The democracy that we're a part of is being tested and threatened in new and dangerous ways. And faith, which should be an asset, a way to appeal to people's best instincts, has instead become a kind of political identity for some. Instead of inviting people in, it divides us up. And instead of bringing out compassion and the search for the common good, it divides, and we share our grievances and our anger. Let me move on here. So what I would like to do in light of that contest, complicated, urgent context, let's talk about our mission in public life. What brings us together? It's not politics or ideology. We're not the Democratic Party of Prayer. We're not the Catholic caucus of the Republican Party. Our mission, I think, was best expressed by Jesus when he began his public life: to bring good news to the poor and liberty to captives, to set the downtrodden free, new sight to the blind. He said, I have come to bring life and to bring it to the full. And he said of us, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Let your light shine before others. So what does it mean to be salt, light, and leaven when it comes to democracy? Well, maybe the most countercultural thing our faith tells us, our church teaches, is that politics is a good thing. We are not a head for the hills religion.
Yeah, I finally got it.
We are called to renew the earth, to be salt, light, and leaven. Both Pope Francis and the Catholic bishops have said responsible citizenship is a virtue and participation in political life is a moral obligation. Pope Francis said, none of us can say I have nothing to do with public life. No, I am responsible. We have to participate according to our ability. Politics is one of the highest forms of charity because it serves the common good. Now, this kind of talk makes some people nervous, maybe makes you nervous. But believers of every stripe have the same rights, same responsibilities as everyone else. We should expect neither favoritism nor discrimination because our values are rooted in our faith. And when people bring their deepest convictions, I think we enrich, not diminish political life. But we have to do so in a context of pluralism and a search for the common good. Because it makes people so nervous, I've often said we have to be clear about what we're not talking about when we're salt, light, and leaven in a democracy. What is faithful citizenship not? Well, it's not about the religious practices of politicians. It's not about the fact that Biden goes to mass more than most Catholics. It's not about that Trump has other priorities on a Sunday morning. Biden seems to quote on eagle's wings, in every speech. He did it just the other day. And Trump has a little trouble getting straight what his favorite passage from the Bible is. It's frankly not about their personal practice of religion. It's not about the political cloud of religious groups. You hear the evangelical vote, the Black vote, Latino vote, Jewish vote. I think people who talk about the Catholic vote without nuance don't know many Catholics, certainly don't know my family. I've told the story a million times of Mrs. O'Reilly in Chicago. Miss O'Reilly believed in her Catholic faith, the Democratic Party, and her family. And her son was taking her to the polls one election, and they were arguing over politics. Son had become a Republican, and he said, "Mother, if Jesus himself came back as a Republican, you wouldn't vote for him." And she looked at him and said, "Well, why would he change his party affiliation after all these years?" Well, that may be true of Mrs. O'Reilly, but it's not true of most of us. Catholics, if you think about it, about 40% of us tip towards the Republican side, about 40% of us tip towards the Democratic side, and about 20% of us are in the middle. And frankly, we have a lot to say about who wins the election. It's also not about our pastors telling us how to vote. That is one thing I think our church is wise about, unlike some of our other friends in the evangelical and even the Black community. We don't want, we don't expect, we don't appreciate our pastors telling us how to vote. So if it's not those things, what is it? Here's my definition. We need to use the resources of our faith and the responsibilities and opportunities of our democracy to defend the life dignity of all God's children, to protect and care for the least of these, to work for peace and solidarity, to care for God's creation and contribute to the common good. And the one in that definition, which I've used for a while, about the opportunities and responsibilities of democracy are more important now because our democratic institutions are under threat. If that's what our task is, if that's what's all being salt, light, and leaven and democracy about, what's the context for us? What are we up against? And I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this, but we have been through a lot. If you think about it, a global pandemic. And I don't know about you, but my parish, my community hasn't recovered yet. Racial reckoning that seems to have receded. I'm part of Georgetown, which sold 272 men, women, and children as slaves to help pay its debts. I grew up a mile from where George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. We have not faced up to the way racism distorts our society and the lives of so many. Our economy is a divided economy with people, many people, doing really, really well, and a lot of people left behind. And inflation and the pandemic have really exacerbated that. The world's on fire. We have a land war in Ukraine. The holiest place on earth is overcome by terror and massive attack against civilians. It seems like we've lost respect for the basics. Innocent human life, civilians should not be targeted in warfare. We have a broken immigration system. The Senate is fighting over an immigration bill, whatever you think of that. It doesn't include a pathway to citizenship. It doesn't do anything about dreamers. We're a polarized society, an angry society. We don't give each other the benefit of doubt. We're divided by class and race and ideology and ethnicity and gender. we seem to sort of organize our lives, many of us, by identity instead of community. We're part of a culture of violence. Pittsburgh knows the horrible attack on your synagogue. Despite Dobbs, we still have hundreds of thousands of abortions. We just had a man gassed to death in Alabama. You're not that far from Canada, where euthanasia is being used more widely against the mentally ill and people facing disabilities. Our politics, I would call demoralized. It seems to be only about power, seems only about taking advantage. It's not about the common good. It's not about the least of these. It's not about building bridges. It's dysfunctional, and I think demoralizing. I mean, they can't seem to do the basics. And then we had this horrible scene of where President Trump would not accept the election and invited and encouraged people to attack the home of our democracy, the Capitol. And 3 years later, we're still fighting over who won the election and what responsibility he bears for that. Our church should be a source of unity and a source of strength in dealing with all this, but we're wounded. Pennsylvania has borne the brunt of the sex abuse crisis in a particular way. Washington, Minnesota, my home. Our credibility has been undermined. The moral, the spiritual, the financial costs have been just enormous. Our leaders seem unable to step up in lots of ways. But the one thing that is really interesting is we have come forward with the encouragement of Pope Francis to talk about a different way to talk about our mission and our work, the Synod, which my colleague Kim Daniels has been a big part of, and gives me some hope that people are sitting down together in prayer, in reflection, trying to think about what we can do together. I'm concerned that the Synod focus on mission, not just our internal affairs. So it's a mixed context, but pretty tough. And then we have this election, and whatever you think of the candidates and all that, this is not an election that most Americans want. They did not want a replay of Biden and Trump. We do know one thing, it's going to be close. One poll had Biden ahead. Most of the polls have Trump ahead. And guess what? Pennsylvania is going to be right in the middle of the fight, along with Wisconsin and Michigan and Arizona, Nevada, maybe North Carolina. I'm not going to share my own views about what we ought to do. I have my own perspectives, but that's not the purpose of tonight. But it is discouraging that the campaign seems not to have much of an agenda. It doesn't focus on the least of these. It's very much on the personalities, and it needs to be focused on the fundamentals at a time of issues of life and death and war and peace, and even the survival of our democracy. I'm going to skip a few things and get over. The one thing I would say about our church, let me move ahead on this. I put this together for a non-Catholic group of funders, and maybe you'll think it's useful, maybe you'll think it's too glib, but for outsiders, I said there's several things you have to know about the Catholic Church in public life. We're large. There's 75 million of us, 80 million. And we just had some studies, only about 25% of us go to church on any given Sunday. That's down substantially. It bothers me. That number includes some of my kids who don't go. But that's still 20 million people. who go to church every Sunday trying to reflect on how they can be a better person and worship God. We're diverse. We're probably the most diverse religious community in the country. Increasingly Latino, very substantial African American and Asian communities, and a lot of people who look like me and a lot of you. We're divided in public life by ethnicity. Latino Catholics are thinking and voting differently than white Catholics, by class, by education, and in many ways by who goes to Mass and who doesn't. We're dysfunctional. I would argue even demoralized. For me, the epitome of this dysfunction, and I'll probably shouldn't say this, but I find it just unimaginable, the power of the resistance to Pope Francis. It's unprecedented. And at least as I look at it, it is powerful, yes. It is narrow. It is elite. It is headquartered in some specific institutions. They have a lot of resources, but it doesn't reflect our church. For some people, it is about how we pray and how we think about morality. It's about protecting the faith. For others, I think it's about preserving power, ecclesial, political, economic power. It's important to remember, and I remind journalists and politicians, and I think we need to remind ourselves as well, aside from the Eucharist, the thing most Catholics agree on is they love Pope Francis. 80% of Catholics support Catholics. That's more than Donald Trump, Joe Biden, the Congress put together. The other thing that's worth remembering is we can make a difference. We can be decisive when we get our act together. Unfortunately, getting our act together requires a lot. So if that's the context, what are our assets? I know this is a little clunky, but and I'll run through this quickly. You know this. We're everywhere. Our presence, our institutions. Think about parishes. Think about Catholic charities. Think about Catholic relief services that Bill Headley served so well. 190 countries. Think of the colleges and universities. We're in every congressional district, every state. And think about what we do. People in this room, the institutions of our church, we feed the hungry, we shelter the homeless, we welcome immigrants, we care for the sick. We put our faith to work. Another asset, as I said, there's a lot of us. And then two things I want to focus on a little bit is the moral framework we bring to public life and the leadership of Pope Francis. There are people on this call who are more expert than I am on Catholic social teaching, but my shorthand description is to remind ourselves that the most important word in Catholic social teaching is the word "and." If you think about it, Catholic social teaching puts together things that our culture, our politics, our economy tear apart. So we're committed to both human life and dignity, to human rights and responsibilities, to family and community, to the priority of the poor and the vulnerable, to the dignity of work and the rights of workers, to solidarity and subsidiarity, to care for the planet and the poorest people on planet. And perhaps bringing all that together, we're committed to the common good in a politics that focuses on our individual needs, desires, and fears. That framework gives us a different way of looking at the world. It gives us a different way of looking at this election. It doesn't fit the categories of right or left, or Democrat or Republican. And then we turn to Pope Francis. It's important to remember what a surprise he was and how clear he was from the very beginning. It's apparently a sin to talk about what goes on in the conclave. So the day after he was elected, Pope Francis called a press conference to talk about what went on in the conclave. I guess he thought it was a venial sin. And he tells the story. He said when the votes were getting close, when he was about to be elected, Cardinal Humes of Brazil, his friend leaned over, hugged him, and said, "Don't forget about the poor." And he said, "That's when I decided I'll call myself Francis, a man of the poor, a man of peace, and a man of creation." Some people say it's hard to figure out what Francis is up to. I don't think it's very complicated. From the very beginning, he looks at the world from the bottom up. He looks at the church and society from the outside in. He calls for an encounter and engagement of judgment and condemnation. Calls for the protection of all life, care for all creation. And if you look at his writings, joy of the gospel, love in the family, justice in the economy, welcome for immigrants, peace in the world, and mercy in the church. And it may be that mercy in the church is what bothers some people the most. But he also talks very much recently about the threats to democracy. He was in Athens, and in Fratelli Tutti, he talked about this. He said, "Today we are witnessing a retreat from democracy. The common bonds of society are being severed by an increasing skepticism of institutions, hyper-individualism, and partisanship. Democracy requires the participation and involvement of all, demands hard work and patience. It is complex, whereas authoritarianism is peremptory and populism's easy answers appear attractive. Democracy may be the response," he said, "to the siren song of authoritarianism, and that individualism, he hoped, and indifference may be overcome by concern for others, for the poor, and for creation." He says the way to defend democracy, the way to pursue the common good, is by concern for others, for the poor, and creation. In Fratelli Tutti, the Pope called for a better kind of politics at the service of the common good. And the question tonight is, how can we help build a better kind of politics? The bishops have written for many years a statement originally called political responsibility, then called faithful citizenship, now called forming consciences for faithful citizenship. When I first came to the conference in 1975, I helped write the first statement. It was 3,000 words. The one that was readopted in November is 17,000 words. And some of the criticism, it's too long, too many quotes, it repeats itself, nobody reads it. But it still offers, I think, some criteria that are useful. The first thing it makes clear, quoting Pope Benedict, is that the church's role in public life is to form consciences, not to impose its teaching. It wants to stimulate greater insight into the requirements of justice. I will tell you the reason why faithful citizenship has no Francis, no not much Benedict in it. It's because our bishops are divided and they can't agree on how to refashion this statement. So they formed a task force who will look at it again after the election. They continue to maintain that abortion is our preeminent priority, and they also cite other threats to life and other claims on their conscience. For me, and only me, I think the protection of human life and dignity is fundamental. But life and dignity are threatened in a number of ways, and we have to examine how public policy impacts those. In a different way, with different moral claims, I think the protection of our democracy and the rights and duties we have as Americans under our Constitution is also a fundamental criteria for how we select our leaders. And Peter Steinfeld's at Commonweal has pointed out that democracy doesn't appear in the bishop's note. They talk about the importance of conscience and prudence, and we have to remind ourselves that conscience doesn't mean that we just find a way to do what we want to do. Conscience calls us to do the hard things. It's the voice in our heart we often don't want to hear. And prudence is not a get out of jail free card. You can't say, I'm a liberal Democrat, I don't need to think about the unborn. I'm a conservative Republican, immigration's just a matter of prudential judgment. I'm pro-life, I don't need to worry about questions of character. To say something is a matter of prudential judgment is the beginning of the conversation, not the end. It's not a way to dismiss those concerns. And faithful citizenship, I think very importantly says it is up to individual Catholics consulting their conscience, understanding the teaching of the church to make their own choices. And it says those decisions should take into account a candidate's commitments, character, and integrity. And I think the questions of character, integrity, and for that matter, capacity and competence are important in this election. In the poster or the flyer for this thing, and I'm about to wrap up here, quoted me saying I'm politically homeless, and I think maybe some others. Politically homeless doesn't mean I don't know what needs to be done, but it is true that a faithful John Paul II Catholic, Benedict Catholic, a Francis Catholic could not be appointed to a major position in either a Republican or Democratic administration. Consistent ethic Catholics don't fit. But that is not a badge of honor. It means we have been unable to persuade our colleagues, our fellow citizens, our leaders. So questions of character, questions of issues of life and death and war and peace and who moves ahead and who gets behind and respect for democracy all are a part of being salt, light, and leaven. But a central question, I think, for each of us is, does your faith shape your politics, or do your politics shape your faith? So the advice for the institution in faithful citizenship is the church is called to be political but not partisan, not cheerleader, not chaplain for any candidate or party. Called to be principled but not ideological, not to compromise on fundamentals, but to work with all people of goodwill to advance our values. To be civil but not soft, calling people war criminals or baby killers probably doesn't advance the dialogue. And to be engaged and not used, to not be props for our political leaders. I do believe that the principles of Catholic social teaching and the message of Pope Francis of encounter and dialogue, discernment, offers a way out both for our church and our politics. And our task is to try to reflect that in our own actions and persuade others to join us. We need leadership that engages and persuades, that doesn't judge and condemn. Mark Shields had a great line. He said, you can tell the health of an institution by whether they're looking for converts or heretics. Francis is looking for converts. Francis calls us to listen and learn. A danger for us is that faith becomes a source of righteousness and judgment, a kind of identity rather than a call to serve, a collection of grievances rather than a way to love God and neighbor, a source of division rather than a contribution to the common good. And we ought to act like we're in this together. We can divide up the work, pro-life, social justice, immigration, peace, but we ought to act like we belong to the same family. We should divide up the work, but not divide the church. So what would a better kind of politics look like? Let me give you an example. First of all, I think the groups that co-sponsor this, the Association Network, the Franciscan Action Network, Catholics for the Common Good, and the rest are an example of a better kind of politics. Next week, we are doing a dialogue on faith and politics with Robert Costa from CBS, Adele Banks from Religion News Service, Laura Barone Lopez from the News Hour, Michael Sean Winters from Catholic News Service, and a great sociologist. And we'll be talking in this election year about what this means. But let me give you an example from my own experience, and I'll finish. Bread for the World is a great example of this work in action. The Catholic Climate Covenant, the Catholic Mobilizing Network, the sponsors of this, Catholic Campaign for Human Development. My mother started a pro-life pregnancy center. Those are all examples of salt, light, and leaven. But there's a group called the Circle of Protection, which I helped start, that tries to stand up in Washington for the poor and the vulnerable. And at one point, there was a proposal to cut everything. And we went to the White House, we met with President Obama, and Bishop Ramirez, representing the Bishops' Conference, looked at the president, and he said, in my Bible, it says, whatever you do for the least of these, you do for me. He said, in Washington, the Bible must be, whatever you do for the most of these, you do for me, because the poor get left behind. And the president looked at him and said, I think you've got us on that. We said, can you exempt from these automatic cuts Medicaid, Medicare, food stamps, the child tax credit, the WIC program, the lifelines for the poorest kids in America? And the president eventually said, if you can convince the Republicans, we'll go along with it. And then we met with Paul Ryan and John Boehner, and we actually got them to agree. So disciples of Jesus came together, provided salt, light, and leaven, and literally millions of families were able to buy shoes for their kids when they began school, a turkey at Thanksgiving, Christmas presents, a better life. Last week, in a very bleak Congress, a Republican and a Democrat, the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee and chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, came together on a bipartisan proposal to expand the child tax credit. $37 billion to extend business tax credits, $37 billion to help poor families. People said it was hopeless. It passed the House by 300 votes. And then it went to the Senate, and one of the senators said, we can't do that. It'll help Biden. Well, it's actually going to help families. So when we work together, when we put the poor first, when we work on a bipartisan basis, when citizens make the case, we can lift up the least of these. The last time I felt this much concern for my country was after 9/11. And we came together at that point. We cared for each other. We also did some terrible things. We started wars that have never ended. But now we seem to be tearing our country apart, and our church seems to be as divided as other. And when, in that period, I was part of a group that went to Ground Zero. And actually, it included a number of priests from Pittsburgh. And we were there as the fires were still burning, the smoke was still rising. A couple times while we were there, everything stopped while they brought out pieces of people. And one of the priests put their arm around me and he said, "John, you know what we were talking about last night? Respect for human life and dignity, solidarity, peacemaking. That's the only way we're going to stop this hate, this horror." He said, "The work you're doing is more important than ever." And I said, "Father, the work you're doing to proclaim the gospel, celebrate the sacraments, comfort your people, to share the good news is more important than ever." And I would say at a very difficult time for our church, for our nation, the work you are doing, each of you, and the work these organizations are doing to be salt, light, and leaven in our democracy is more important than ever. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you for wrestling and trying to get your head and your heart and your arms around so much. Very much appreciated. So many good thoughts, a good framework for all of us to think about, our own response to these challenging times and to some of the politics ahead, both internal to the church and also in our society. So Marge T. from Baltimore, Maryland, asked a question. She said there's so many people in their own pods, or I'll also add echo chambers in our society today. How do we create opportunities for conversations with people who may disagree with us, and also do that without having a lot of anger happen in both parties?
Well, I'm speaking to myself in answering this question. I need to check my own anger at the door. One of the most useful things I learned, and it took a long time, is one of the most important sentences in the English language is, "I could be wrong about this, but," and then to offer your opinion. And then to ask, "What do you think and why do you think it?" I think one of the things we're learning from the Synod is that listening and learning is better than proclaiming and debating. And my temptation, speaking personally, is to proclaim and debate. And I would do a lot better listening and learning. There is a reason why so many people feel ignored, neglected, left out in a variety of ways. In the African American community, the Latino community, among white families who feel the economy has left them aligned, and an openness to listen and learn and then try to engage and persuade offers the most promise. I saw somebody said I'm running on pure anger. First of all, at least for me, that's really hard to draw life from. I get it. I'm a part of it all the time, but I got to find another way to channel things so that I feel like I'm making a difference. Mark Shields' comment about looking for converts instead of heretics, I think, is not only good for bishops, but it's also good for us. Greg Erlinson said, he said, in the Catholic Church, we're so divided, we've forgotten we're part of one family, and we ought to be able to talk to each other. And I think we live in little bubbles or bunkers, and it's important to try and get out of that.
Thank you, John. Before we go to the next question, I just had a couple of shout outs. One to Mary Novak, who's Executive Director of Network in DC, and also Denise Murphy McGraw, Patrick Carolyn, who are co-founders of Catholics Vote Common Good. So thanks for being with us tonight. John, next question.
Okay.
In this section, I'm going to ask a couple questions that relate to each other, and you can decide where you want to jump in. But one is, why isn't Catholic or Catholic social teaching not more of a priority and not really made a part of the church's education outreach in parishes? And the other would be is, how do you talk to a pastor about the issue of injustice when they don't seem open to it?
Well, before I get to that, I just want to say how much I admire Mary and the work of Network for many years. And her leadership, Joan Neal's leadership, is a blessing for all of us. And if you're looking for a place to put your energy, they make the case for salt, light, and leaven. And Patrick has served for so long in so many different ways. So I'm a little embarrassed that they're listening in. They could make this case more powerfully than I can. But why is it so neglected? It's just hard. We have bought a kind of partial gospel that is obsessed with individual sin and grace and prayer and action. I shouldn't say obsessed, focused, where issues of human sexuality have dominated for a long time. Not that those aren't important. And there is this sort of myth that this is not real doctrine. And that is undermined by the scriptures. It is undermined by the tradition of the church. It is undermined by John Paul II, by Benedict VI, by Francis, by the US bishops. We have not devoted the energy, the resources, and the urgency to sharing the message. I do think there are signs of hope. I think Catholic education takes this a lot more seriously. And I have to say, I have taught a course at Georgetown on Pope Francis, Catholic social teaching and public life. And I think this younger generation, this resonates with them. This is what they think faith ought to be about. So I can be a little discouraged, a lot discouraged. I can be a little demoralized, but I think we have opportunities. I think young people, and I think the African American and Latino community, women, particularly women religious, are leaders in reminding us this is the core of our faith, not on the edge of it. And we ought to act like it.
Thank you. So, John, I'm going to go through 4 issues, and they've been asked about in one way or the other in the chat. And I'm going to ask you if you would take a few minutes for each. We'll go one at a time. I'll list all 4 just so people know what's coming up, but I'll take you through one at a time. And if you could kind of comment on how you see it, as a church issue, but then also how you see it as a campaign issue this year. And we'll take one at a time. So the 4 issues are gun violence, immigration, abortion, LGBTQ rights. So take I'll let you take the first one you want to answer, and then I'll keep track of them and prompt you on each one.
Kevin, if I knew there was going to be a quiz, I would have studied harder. The let's take abortion. It is in many ways a central issue, and it should be. I mean, we have almost 1 million abortions in the richest nation on earth. 1 million times people have said that I don't see a future for me or my children. And there have been leaders in the Catholic community, including our bishops, who have focused primarily on the legal. And they have won a major victory. But I said to a bishop recently, I think you've won the court and you may be losing the country. It has energized the pro-choice folks because they see this about the rights of women. And frankly, the unborn child has disappeared in the debate, which I think is wrong. This is now a matter primarily for state action. There's not going to be an abortion ban. There's not going to be a right to abortion at the federal level. I think the Hyde Amendment, which prohibits federal funding for abortion, stays because of the divisions in our society. So now the question is not how do you win in the courts, it's how do you win people's hearts and minds? How do you provide help that encourages people to see their child as a part of their life instead of a threat to their life? And we are very good at talking about that. We are not very good at doing it. My mother, conservative Republican, started the pro-life pregnancy center in my town, and she was furious that her party was going to cut Medicaid, cut WIC, cut all the lifelines for the women and babies she helped. We could come together to provide, to try and provide concrete help for women and babies who need it a lot. The science is most women choose abortion because they don't think there's a future for their child and for themselves, and a lot of that is economic. That's part of why I think the child credit is important symbolically and really. So that tests all of us. Frankly, if you believe in the consistent life ethic, you need to be consistent, and that goes both ways. You don't have to support a particular legal answer or a ban or this, but you have to figure out a way that every life can be valued, and we're a long way from that. Gun violence is an extension of that. Mm-hmm. The kids who are killed in our schools, the kids who were killed in Uvalde at a concert in a supermarket, their lives are precious in God's eyes. And somehow we have defined this as an absolutely political issue, not a human issue. And I don't know how we break this. This is one where some of our colleagues are doing better work. Part of it is the way campaigns are financed, and part of it is the way that political parties are run and how congressional districts are gerrymandered. So the people looking for reasonable solutions are marginalized. But this is an example where the vast majority of Americans believe, for example, that assault weapons ought to be banned. But the people with the money and political power can stop that from happening. LGBT issues. This is, in many ways, the one of the examples of the most significant transformation of our culture ever. You won't find Donald Trump or conservative Republicans saying we ought to repeal gay marriage. And the way people in the LGBTQ community prevailed was not through partisan politics. It was not through ideology. It was by making this very personal, talking about people in your own family who are living with this and what kind of life they ought to have. And should their lives be diminished because of who they love. And church teaching, I'm not a theologian, I'm certainly not a moral theologian, but Pope Francis, from the moment of who am I to judge to when someone asks for a blessing, you give a blessing, has opened this up in a substantial way, I think, for our community. So unlike gun violence, which is stymied, unlike abortion, which is absolutely divided and polarized with the extremes dominating the discussion, the gay rights movement has shown a way to build bridges and pull people in. So I don't know if I covered all four, and I probably offended.
Well, I'll bridge you. So can you take that thought on human rights, basic human right, basic respect for life, share thoughts on, and this is just in the interest of time, put in one big ball, and it's unfair to everybody who asks individual questions, so I apologize in advance. But, the issue of immigration, the issue of, what do we do about Palestinians who are being killed by the thousands? What about Israelis who were killed by 8,000, in a brutalistic, right? Like what, as a country, and as a Catholic, how are we called to respond to some of that?
Well, something fundamental has broken down, that a child caught in barbed wire in a river in Texas is not a child of God. It's not a terrible loss for a family or a community. It's a political issue. It's a casualty of politics. In Ukraine, in Israel, in Gaza, what has been lost is the most basic rules that you don't target civilians, that there are some things you cannot do, even in wartime, even to defend yourself. And it seems to me we have just plowed through that. And so by demonizing immigrants, by making enemies of the other side, we forget that our judgment depends on how we treat the least of these, including those who are our enemies. So there are people who say there are no fundamental moral rules, that everything's relative, everything depends on the situation. And there are times when I sort of like that because I want to cut a corner or two. I would argue that this is an example where fundamentals are really important. The life and dignity of another person cannot be collateral damage. They cannot be the cost of your political struggle. They cannot be the way you prevail in a conflict. And one of the good things about being a part of a church that values human life and all life is it gives us a place to stand with immigrants. And frankly, we've lost a lot of ground. This new bill has no pathway to citizenship, has no relief for DACA. And the carnage in Ukraine and Gaza and the terrible attacks in Israel represent a fundamental break with human decency and morality. And if religious people can't stand up and say, there are some things that you cannot do, then we've lost something really important.
Thank you. And then we're hitting the home stretch. So let me pull it back and pivot a little bit and look at this from an emotional, spiritual standpoint, which is there's so much fear right now in our society, as well as our church, frankly. There's so much disinformation. Where do you, John, where do you fall back to and find hope in the midst of all this?
Well, some days it's hard. You know, it can be pretty discouraging, but take a look at the death penalty. When I first went to the conference, the Catholic bishop voted by one vote to oppose the death penalty and could not agree on why they opposed it. Opposing the death penalty is now in the catechism. It unites the bishops. It unites probably the people on this call. And our country is choosing not to use the death penalty. Prosecutors aren't charging people. Juries aren't convicting people and demanding the death penalty. Judges aren't giving it. There are still a few states that insist on this. And under Donald Trump and William Barr, there was an orgy of federal executions at the end. But this is an example where over time, we have made real progress. And at the beginning, it was only the church and the ACLU and a couple other groups that were fighting it. Now, for a variety of reasons, including, I think, that Pope John Paul II forgave his assassin, we're deciding that this is not the way we solve problems. I found the action in the last week on the tax credit to be a sign of hope. I find the young people I work with at Georgetown to be real signs of hope. We do a lot of work with young Latino leaders and young Catholic leaders who work on the Hill and in government and the rest. And they want more than business as usual. They want a life of meaning, and they want to make a difference. And their idealism is connected to their faith, and their faith can sustain them. And in fact, understanding Catholic social teaching leads them to be more committed to Christ and his church, despite the discouragement that we all feel sometimes. But a little story. I talked about my daughter-in-law and the terrible thing that happened. They belong to a little parish in Atlanta, and that whole parish has just rallied to them. And it was an example of community. And my question is not just for Katie, but how do we begin to rally for each other when race diminishes the lives of African-American kids, or anti-immigrant demonization destroys the hopes of immigrant kids? How can we begin to see each other as sisters and brothers and children of God instead of talking points or threats? So I begin by saying it can be pretty discouraging. I think a lot of us feel that with some intensity. But I think faith is Calvary and resurrection, passion and new life. And it's holding those two things together that gives me some hope.
Thank you, John. I think that's a good place for us to draw things to a close. And with that, just a couple announcements. But before that, just a huge thanks, John, for just being with us, sharing what you did, stimulating, thought-provoking, prayer-provoking. It was so good. These opportunities. There's so much affirmation in the chat. Thank you for the people who posted there, but everybody is very, very grateful for your time and your thoughts shared. So, and we want to thank you, and thank you for the Association of Pittsburgh Priests for pulling this together and allowing this to happen. Really tremendous. So